part 2, Dr. Judy's book. So where I got up to in part 1 was when she started doing the research on the XMRV, which is the xenotropic murine leukemia-related virus. So murine is mouse, by the way. So this is where I'm going to get started again, because this is when she discovered the connection between this virus and chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, it does make you wonder, because they really tried to bury this research. Is it because chronic fatigue syndrome is predominantly a woman-related illness? Is it because it was considered a yuppie syndrome for women who tried to work as hard as the men? So, in 2009, now in academia, Midovitz and Ricchetti, that's her boss, she's loved him forever, who was still at NCI, led a team that discovered a strong association between a previously unknown retrovirus and myalgic encephalomyelitis, commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. Predictably, the retrovirus was also linked to certain blood cancers. Collaborators had named it xenotropic murine leukemia-related virus, XMRV. So if you hear Dr. Judy talking in any of her videos out there, she keeps talking about XMRV. This is what she's talking about. When they first detected it in DNA sequences in prostate cancer a few years earlier. The medical community had dealt with chronic fatigue syndrome, which strikes mostly women, in bad faith since its appearance in the mid-80s. And it was actually around in the 70s, because I heard a doctor speak it a few years ago, and he was a Belgian doctor. And because he was a psychiatrist, anyone who suffered the usual effects of chronic fatigue, they would get sent to a shrink, because it was sort of like, nothing's showing up in the blood test. It must be all in your head. So what he ended up doing, this doctor from Belgium, was a huge amount of blood work on people. And he ended up finding that, yes, their bloods were within normal range, but people with chronic fatigue syndrome, they would actually start to feel better if they had higher than normal levels of everything in their blood. So what is a good magnesium level for you and I? For someone with chronic fatigue or ME, they can't get away with that level. Their bodies require much more because of the mitochondrial distress that's going on in their system and their DNA challenges. The medical establishment decided ME and chronic fatigue syndrome was a yuppie flu, and attributed to the inherent psychological fragility of women, career women pursuing professions in high-pressure corporate ecosystems. Midovitz found evidence for the retrovirus in approximately 67% of women afflicted with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, and a little less than 4% in healthy population. So 60%, 67% in women with chronic fatigue, or 4% in the normal population. Like, that's a huge difference. On 8th of October 2009, Midovitz and Ricchetti published their explosive findings in the journal Science, describing the first ever isolation of the recently discovered retrovirus, XMRV. So that's the xenotropic murine leukemia-related virus, and its association to ME and chronic fatigue. Her revelations about ME and chronic fatigue immediately triggered angry reactions from jealous cancer power centers, stubbornly resistant to science that attributed cancer and neuroimmune diseases to viruses. The blowback, so people who talk to, I always cop things about something. You're not scientific. You get away from this. Science has decided. What a load of crap. Science should be an ever-evolving amount of information where when people learn new things, they change tack, but that is not what's happening with the pharmaceutical companies around the world. It's just not. So they don't want to connect things like that, because they've already got their systems with their chemos, their vaccines, their radiations. They've already got their trillion-dollar industry worked out. The blowback grew even grimmer when Midovitz's subsequent research suggested that the new retrovirus, originally found in mice, had somehow jumped into humans via contaminated vaccines. Even more troubling to the medical establishment, Dr. Midovitz's research revealed that many of the female patients afflicted with XMRV also had children with autism. Suspecting XMRV might be passed from mother to child, as with HIV, Midovitz treated 17 of the children. 14 showed evidence of the virus. Those findings dovetailed with parental reports of autistic regression following vaccinations. Subsequent studies linked XMRV to epidemics in leukemia, prostate cancer, autoimmune disease, and the explosion of Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is the first time I've actually ever heard the connection to Alzheimer's. As a naturopath, in the last 10 years or so, I've been to, a dozen seminars on dementia and Alzheimer's. And there's so many things leading into things like xenoestrogens, so dodgy plastics, that sort of thing, crossing the blood-brain barrier, high sugar levels, so dementia is considered like third stage diabetes. And we have had things like the staph and strep, which can cross the blood-brain barrier in some people and get into the basal ganglia in the brain and mess with people. So, but nonetheless, I hadn't actually heard of retroviruses crossing and being connected to Alzheimer's. Worst yet, research also found widespread XMRV contamination in the blood supply and blood products. Based on her research and the findings of others, it seemed that anywhere from 3 to 8% of the population now carry the virus. XMRV has become part of the human ecology, passed from mother to child or through the breast milk. Midovitz's data suggested more than 10 million Americans have harbored this virus like ticking time bomb, a potential threat far greater than the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In January 2011, HIV/AIDS expert Ben Burkhout, published these explosive revelations in the journal Frontiers in Microbiology. He included Midovitz's evidence that mouse tissue used in vaccine production was the likely vector for human contamination. Unbeknownst to Judy, her co-author on the book, Ken Heckenlively, had already independently discovered published medical research showing that the first recorded outbreak of ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, was among 198 doctors and nurses in Los Angeles County Hospital in 1934-35, following their injection with an experimental polio vaccine grown in mouse brain tissue. Midovitz's evidence threatened financial catastrophe for the world's pharmaceutical companies because of their negligent use of animal cell cultures to produce vaccines and other pharmaceutical products. Her findings put billions of dollars of revenue from an entire branch of medicine called biologics, which depends on animal tissues and products. Now, I just want to make a note of the biologics for a sec, because it's been bugging me. Why don't vaccines have to be safety tested? So Robert Kennedy Jr. and Del Bigtree went to the High Court of America last year to get access to the safety research for children's studies for over the past 30 years. And there was only one study, and it was 4 days after injections, and there was no placebo. So apparently with pharmaceuticals, there have to be safety studies, but with biologicals, they don't. So vaccines are in the class of drugs called biologics, which depend on animal tissue and products. So that now makes sense to me. Pharmaceutical companies and their captive regulators unleashed a furious broadside against Midovitz and Ricchetti, besieging them from every stronghold. The journal Science feverishly pressed Midovitz to retract her October 2009 article. In September 2011, the Whitmore-Peterson Institute at the University of Nevada, Reno, fired Judy from her faculty job. Judy and her family noticed menacing-looking men, and this is where it goes into the whole thing where basically she never got charged with anything. They planted evidence in her home. Her husband was threatened. Her friend was threatened. And then this 5-year ban on her speaking out. So basically, she is someone who really did get into big trouble for having ethics as a scientist, refusing to back down with her knowledge of what was found, and In the next bit, it actually goes into a whole bunch of people in history who have found things, who have been persecuted by the pharmaceutical industry. So I'll do that one. I might do that one tomorrow or the next day. But anyway, I know it's only a little bit, but I'm finding it fascinating. I'm just loving reading about her. And anytime you see a video with Dr. Judy Mitovits, keep an eye out. She's spectacular. I just love her. You can feel the truth emanating from her body. Plague of Corruption, Dr. Judy Mitovits. Thanks, Dr. Judy.